And we are back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow, and I always look forward to speaking with my next guest. Maximillian Alvarez is the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network, and he's the host of the podcast Working People, and Working People is exactly what I want to talk about with Max today. So without any further ado, Maximillian Alvarez, thanks for coming back on the program.
Hey, man, thanks so much for having me on. Good to see you.
Yeah, always good to talk to you. So you did, speaking of Working People, you did two stories recently at therealnews.com that I wanted to talk to you about, both work-related. But let's start with this one. Your headline, "No justice, question mark, no bourbon, exclamation mark. Distillery workers in Kentucky go on strike." It reminded me of this cup. I meant to bring it that I got from Working Class History. It says "No tea, question mark, no work." And it shows a worker's fist. It's British. But echoing to the subhead, echoing similar demands from Frito-Lay, Amazon, and Warrior Met coal workers around the country. About 400 union distillery workers in Bardstown, Kentucky want respect, fair compensation, and work schedules that ensure time to spend with their families. So what's the breakdown there? What's going on in Bardstown, Kentucky?
Yeah, well, once again, really appreciate you taking an interest in this story. I know that there's a lot of activity kind of going on around the country, especially on the labor front. We have the Nabisco strike that's been going on since August. The union there reached a tentative agreement with Nabisco, but the membership still has to vote on it. But things were getting pretty violent on the picket line that we were seeing this week with strike breakers and Pinkerton-esque security forces. I think 10,000 union carpenters are about to go on strike in the Pacific Northwest. So there's a lot going on, and it always, it's important to kind of try to highlight as many struggles as we can. And this struggle in Kentucky, I think, is very important. As you mentioned, a little over 400 union distillery workers in Bardstown, Kentucky, who work for the distillery Heaven Hill, which produces some of the most popular bourbons in the world, including Elijah Craig and Evan Williams. They hit the picket line this Monday, and their demands, as I mentioned in the publishing information at the Real News Network, echo a lot of the demands from workers that we've been seeing, even those that we discussed the last time I was on your show, right? I think when I interviewed so for this Working People episode, I interviewed Matt Aubrey, who is the president of the UFCW Local 23D, which represents these distillery workers. Matt told me after we finished recording this interview that he was very appreciative of the fact that I didn't just kind of focus on the issue of wages, because so much of local and national media only knows how to interpret labor struggles through that lens of like raises and benefits, and there are often a lot of other factors at play here, and that's very much the case for the strike at Heaven Hill distilleries. There are kind of points of contention with the contract negotiations that led to the membership voting down the latest contract offer last week, which include removing a cap on health insurance premiums, which obviously reduces take-home pay. There would be kind of cuts to overtime. But I think the thing that really is sticking, the biggest sticking point for the membership is Heaven Hill, has like Nabisco, like Frito-Lay, right? The pandemic has actually seen a real boom for these sort of consumer product industries. Bourbon has been kind of on a steady incline in demand around the world during the pandemic. And so like the Frito-Lay workers that I believe we discussed last time, Heaven Hill has been trying to kind of meet this demand by imposing longer schedules, by imposing sort of weekend work and overtime. And so one of the biggest points of contention for the union was that in this new contract, it would kind of basically allow for these sort of abnormal weekend schedules, especially for new hires. But the problem was that the contract did not specify if kind of existing union members would be pushed into those like erratic weekend schedules if the company could not find enough new hires to kind of cover it. And therein, the kind of critique is, we want predictable schedules so that we can have time to spend with our families, like so many other workers. These distillery workers in Kentucky, they were deemed essential throughout the pandemic, not just because of the bourbon that they were producing, but one kind of interesting facet to the story that I'm trying to highlight for people is, if you remember, in the early days of the pandemic, there was actually a hand sanitizer shortage.
Right.
And so we saw some kind of really gross things where, states like New York were using prisoners to make hand sanitizer. Another facet to that story is that a lot of microbreweries, including in the bourbon belt, were using their equipment to produce hand sanitizer, and they actually helped fill that shortage at a very critical time for people. So these workers risked their lives going into work during a pandemic. They also performed essential services to help the rest of the population. They've sacrificed, at a time when Heaven Hill's sales were increasing. And now, Heaven Hill is repaying them by essentially kind of pushing them into a contract that leaves all the discretion up to the company itself to push workers into these abnormal schedules that would prevent them from spending time with their families and being able to live, where Matt Aubrey, invoked the famous saying, we want to work to live, not live to work. And a contract like this doesn't allow us to do that. And that's really important. It's not just about wages and benefits.
It's so interesting, and it makes me think that, every worker's struggle in some way is a microcosm or reflects broader issues. It's not just about these 400 workers, but it's about social forces that are being reflected through them and through their employer. The pandemic has made essential workers more valuable than ever, but as they've done for the last 40, 50 years at least, employers want to keep any upside for themselves and leave a downside to the working people that make them wealthy. And to me, the fact that they're going beyond wages and benefits is so important too, because it shows that this is a quality of worker struggles that goes back hundreds of years that doesn't get enough coverage, certainly in mainstream media, right? That they say, well, they're striking for more benefits, or they're striking for more wages, or and of course those things are critically important and woefully deficient right now for workers, but they don't ever think about worker autonomy as human beings. The fact that whether you're a restaurant worker, a fast food worker whose boss feels they can call you in, they can tell you on Tuesday night that you're working the night shift on Wednesday, they don't care if you have childcare issues or anything else, or whether it's these workers wanting to be able to have some control over their time. This worker autonomy is so important, right? Because it means the worker is in charge of his or her own labor. The employer should not be in charge. And to me, this demand is a move in the right direction.
I would agree. I mean, I think it is, really significant that we're hearing a lot of workers in different industries kind of around the country and even beyond, like really raise these same concerns, right? Really asserting that we are human beings, as you said. As human beings, we not only deserve to be treated with respect, but also we deserve to have time with our families. We deserve to have vacation time. We deserve to have more of a life than just going to work, getting squeezed for more and more hours, coming home being so exhausted that we can't really do anything else, and then just going back to work, the next day. That is a concern that the Warrior Met Coal strikers, who have now been on strike for almost 7 months, and we shouldn't forget about them. That's a big part of what they were calling for and have been calling for. It's a huge part of the Amazon workforce. It's something that gig workers around the country have been talking about. Same with educators, and same with nurses and kind of hospital staff. There's another one of the other longest running strikes is the St. Vincent Hospital strike in Worcester, Massachusetts, which has been going on since May, I believe. And we shouldn't forget about them either. But what they, have been fighting the hospital or the Texas-based investment-like company that owns the hospital and wants to kind of turn it towards a profit-driven model. What they've been saying is we need lower nurse to patient ratios so that we can give our patients the kind of care that they deserve instead of just treating them. Again, like not only are the workers saying we deserve to be treated like human beings, but we need time to treat our patients like human beings instead of just as customers that we're kind of milling through the process. And the company's fighting them on that. They don't want workers to have that kind of say. They want workers to just shut up and take, like whatever, the company gives them. And so I think that, it is really significant that workers are asserting this. And I think that, we have actually been kind of living through, sort of quietly, like one of the most significant, mass labor actions, if we can call it that, in our lifetimes, where coming, quote unquote, coming out of the pandemic, we're still not out of the pandemic, and we probably won't ever be the way that we've handled it. But a lot of workers, who've had their unemployment benefits, extended unemployment benefits cut off. We heard all this talk from the business class about there being a labor shortage and how no one wants to work and yada, yada, yada. Workers are pushing back against that. They're saying, no, we're just not going to go into hazardous jobs with erratic schedules that work us overtime for $7.25 an hour. We're worth more than that. Again, they're asserting their kind of humanity. They're asserting their rights and the dignity that they deserve. One of the kind of crucial things that I think listeners need to sit with, and this was a point that the brilliant labor organizer David Story in Alabama said to me, was that the reason why something like a struggle like Heaven Hill is so important, and the reason why a union is so important, right, is that workers who want to push against what the boss is giving them, with a union, they have the power to stay and fight. What so many workers around the country have been doing is they've been rejecting the wages that bosses have been offering. They've been rejecting the treatment that they've been getting, but their main course of action is to just leave and to try to find a different job instead of staying and fighting, the way that the workers at Heaven Hill are. And that's, I think, a sign again of how far the labor movement still has to go, because if workers had the capacity to stay and push against these low wages and this poor treatment, we might see more movement than what we're currently seeing. But the Heaven Hill Distillery, I think, is a good example of what, having a union, having community support can mean when you don't want to leave your job, but you also don't want to take the crap your boss is giving you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm also still trying to wrap my head around that bourbon was declared like essential in a pandemic. I mean, I'm not sure. I wonder if there's like a economic thing here where like it's very much in the owner's interest to have it declared essential, right? I mean, I used to think bourbon was essential, but I had to quit drinking, so that doesn't count. But one of the things that strikes me about all this, Max, and one of the reasons why I love your stories on this and talking to you about this is it struck me, and correct me if you have a different impression, but it struck me for years now that the real action in the labor movement, it doesn't feel top down. It feels, I mean, you've got these locals who are active. Sometimes, like in the teachers' strike, though, even the locals aren't, the teachers take the lead before even the locals get involved. It seems to me that this is genuinely like 1,000 flowers kind of blooming up through the concrete in different parts of the country, almost spontaneously. And one of the, again, if you agree with that, if you don't agree with that, let me know. But, if that's correct, then to me, one of the important things people like you guys at The Real News, we can do, other people can do, is spread these stories, right? Because to help more people know that you don't have to take this crap, that in fact there are other people resisting and winning. But do you agree with my impression that this is almost more of a localized spontaneous movement beginning to arise from below?
I think it's a bit of a mix, honestly. I guess on your point, I would agree, right, that there is a lot of rank and file kind of movement, and that's very exciting. And I think that the media and social media and just kind of the general visibility of these struggles has been really crucial because, as we know, for the longest time, worker strikes, let alone kind of organizing drives, like a lot of workers' struggles in this country were not given much media attention, or if they were,
Right.
they were often vilified, or disparaged in the press. I mean, even when I was interviewing Matt Aubrey for this episode on the Heaven Hill strike, we had a good laugh about a local report that started with like 400 angry union workers, like hit the picket line. It's just like, man, even just that kind of subtle, like anti-unionism just
Sure,
kind of bleeds
absolutely.
through.
Yeah.
And so I think that, yeah, the more either neutral to sympathetic coverage, the more that people have been showing support, the more emboldened that workers can feel, and the more that they feel like they're not going to be just kind of isolated like the bosses want them to be. That was, I think, another thing to really underscore in my interview with Matt Aubrey, is he kept highlighting the fact that the community response has been tremendous, that he was really, in fact, shocked to not only see kind of the resolve of the union members themselves, but also the support that they've been getting from the community in this strike. And I think that we've heard similar things from the Frito-Lay workers in Topeka, Kansas, from and beyond Topeka, from the Nabisco strikers around the country. So I think that is playing a role in making workers feel more emboldened. I do think there is a lot of grassroots kind of rank and file energy. Obviously, when we are kind of pushing, those of us who support, a robust labor movement and believe that the United States and beyond, having a robust labor movement is in fact imperative for having a more democratic and just society. We want to encourage that, right? We want to report on it. We want people to understand the significance of it. But that can occasionally lead us to kind of, not focus on the fact that there still are, issues with certain unions, like, the struggle that Luis Feliz Leon is reporting on for labor notes with the carpenters in the Pacific Northwest is a perfect example of that, right? So, it is a bit of a mixed bag. And I think that there are some unions that are really kind of heeding the call. There are others that, are kind of seeing kind of efforts to, replace leadership or inject the unions with kind of more of that rank and file energy. So we're seeing things kind of in process. And it is really exciting to see. But, I guess the headline is that this is kind of these are sort of the growing pains of a movement that has been knocked on its butt for many years. So we still have a long way to go, but I think what we're seeing is indeed very encouraging.
And again, we're talking with Maximillian Alvarez of the Real News Network, editor-in-chief there. You also did an episode recently and, warned people that we'll be talking about the topics of suicide and bullying, but you did an episode recently regarding the death of a young man named Evan Seafried. He was 20 years old. He worked at a Kroger in a supermarket in grocery store in Milford, Ohio, and became the dairy department manager. And that now then he took his own life. The family is suing, saying he was bullied, harassed, and sabotaged. And you talked with Evan's mother and father and his brother about this whole incident. And I guess before we get into the Evan's story, Max, why do you think that? Let me put this a different way. What is the deeper significance? It's a tragedy, of course, and a terrible story. What is the importance of a story like Evan's?
Yeah, I've been sitting with this question in my own head since I found out about the story and have been working with the family to kind of get the interview, edit the interview, and publish it and promote it. It's I'd be lying if I said it wasn't the most difficult working people episode that I think I've ever done. Both recording it with the family that had just lost like their son and their brother. They loved him to death, and that's a hole that in their family that will never be filled, right? And I just really want to kind of once again express my gratitude to Evan's mother, father, and brother for showing just a tremendous amount of bravery and resolve to come on the show, to share their stories so openly and vulnerably, even though it was clearly incredibly painful. But they want people to know Evan's story, right? They want to hold Kroger accountable, and most of all, as they said to me on the show, they want workers at Kroger's all over the country, and any worker who is feeling isolated and bullied and dehumanized, they want them to know that they're not alone, that there are ways that they can find help, that there are people who will support them in ways that Evan Seyfried himself was not supported. I think it's important, for a number of reasons, right? I mean, it's the lawsuit that has been filed by the family details a truly horrendous campaign, an orchestrated campaign of workplace bullying, that alleges that the store manager herself, this new store manager that came in, was kind of the lead instigator of this. And Evan Seyfried had tried to report the kind of bullying and harassment he was getting, got no response from HR at Kroger, got no help from his local union, and he really was kind of abandoned, right? And so I guess kind of linking it back to what we were talking about before, when I said not every union, not every local, is just all sunshine and rainbows, right? There are a lot of nitty gritty problems that need to be hammered out. And in this case, the union failed Evan. Kroger failed Evan. His managers failed him. And now he's no longer here because these people failed him, right? And we have to understand that these are the real human stakes, right, of not having a say in your workplace or not being supported when you are facing kind of the horrible treatment from management. Evan really cared about his job. He, as you said, he'd worked there for nearly 20 years. He took a lot of pride in the work that he did. As his family told me, he, appreciated working at Kroger as an Ohio boy. He felt kind of this attachment to Kroger as kind of the, local success story. But he and the family really noticed changes over the past decade, with kind of the new CEO, Rodney McMullen, kind of coming into Kroger and really expanding, right? I mean, pretty much every, grocery store has been bought up by Kroger. I mean, not all of them, but most of them. That's what it's been growing kind of almost exponentially. It's been very focused on maximizing sales within each individual store. And the family, directly links that sort of philosophy that's been pushed from the top down to the very kind of treatment that Evan got and the kind of help that he did not get. And I think that that's also significant, right? Because when we talk about the greed and the profit hungry prerogatives of big corporations like Kroger that only care about stock buybacks and increasing sales and expanding as much as they possibly can to dominate the market, right? We know in the abstract, that those things, kind of hurt working people, but they also, as I think this episode shows, can really hurt us on the most intimate individual levels, where we're being treated like less than human. We're being kind of abused even. But as far as the kind of corporate philosophy of a place like Kroger goes, that's all okay. That's all fine as long as the store is kind of turning out the numbers that it needs to. And I think that, again, these are sort of allegations that have been made, and we'll kind of see how the lawsuit itself plays out. But I mean, the bare fact is that no one was there to help Evan when he needed it most. And he felt isolated, bullied, alone, sabotaged. And he ultimately, as the family said, suffered a kind of, dissociative break and took his own life. I guess the last thing I would say is that, Evan's brother, Eric, made a really important point where he said he wanted listeners to know that he's like, my brother didn't have a history of suffering from depression. He didn't have suicidal ideation. Like, this was something that he was pushed to, and the treatment that he got really directly contributed to Evan's kind of psychotic, break. And that's really important for us to kind of think about, sit with, and I want folks out there to know that they have options. There are people who can support them. If you are feeling this way, please listen to the episode and reach out to folks who can support you. Yeah, it's just a really truly awful story.
And there are resources for that, and we'll mention one after the segment. One of the things that struck me about Evan's story is, I don't know much about the corporate culture, the new corporate culture of Kroger with the new president and so on, but it seems to me, and I saw it in my own, corporate life or whatever, there is a strong element in many corporate cultures of aggression, that the way to get ahead is to treat everybody aggressively, including the people who report to you, your so-called subordinates, and if they're not sufficiently aggressive in their own personal style, then you beat up, essentially emotionally torment them to try to make them conform to this or to drive them out. And as I say, I don't know if this is the case with Kroger, but I know there have been stories about Amazon having a culture like that. There have been stories. I've had that own experience of being in that kind of culture myself. It's enormously unpleasant. It's enormously stressful. And I can see how it would break a person down. It nearly did to me. And not only the stress of going through it, but of seeing others being tormented. That is also extremely painful to experience and observe and be part of. So it seems to me that, I don't want to read more into it since I'm not intimate with Evan's story, or Kroger's culture, but it seems to me that it might reflect a very poisonous or dark trend in corporate culture and in the way we run our economy, which is cutthroat, competitive, go 24/7, and that employees at all levels are expected to be utterly dedicated to the job. In that sense, it might tie to even the Berman story in terms of, you just, when we need you, you're there and all that. And I just wonder if this isn't, I wonder how many other Evans are out there we don't hear about.
I think it's a really important point, and I'd say I have to imagine there are many, but in a lot of ways I don't have to imagine. I've spoken to others who I know feel this way. I've felt this way myself, like you said, and I think that it is indicative, right, of the larger sickness of the way that we run, our economy, right? It forces us to be cannibals, right? To really see our fellow workers as enemies in this sort of zero-sum game, to where the stakes are very high, right? That zero-sum game, if someone gets a job that I don't get, if someone gets a promotion that I don't get, our society has so few other supports that you're talking about, the stakes being whether or not you can pay rent, whether or not, you can afford food for your kids, so on and so forth, right? We dangle people's economic livelihoods like carrots at the end of a stick. Yeah. And that forces us all to, I think, really, live in ways that hurt us, and that, eschew the natural solidarity that we feel towards one another, because we are forced to be so worried about our own economic precarity. We're forced to worry about, being on the right or the left hand side of a boss who has our economic livelihoods in their hands, which I think is something that you can see playing out in Evan's story, and with like his fellow coworkers. Evan himself was a very dedicated employee. He was also, very dedicated to justice and fairness. He had helped other employees file sexual harassment claims, which, the lawsuit alleges actually contributed to the campaign against him. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Evan was very insistent about wearing his mask, and was in fact bullied and made fun of. And that the politics of that were used to distance Evan from the rest of the staff. And if you're another staff member and you're seeing how the dairy aisle manager is being treated over this stuff, of course you're going to kind of like recede into yourself, because you don't want to get that kind of treatment. And so, it really is, I think, a pervasive thing that many of us know kind of intimately, because so many jobs in this country are kind of, there to be engines of a kind of twisted social engineering where, if you get those quote unquote starter jobs in high school or out of high school, whether it be fast food or retail or gig work, it's almost a rite of passage to educate you in the experience of being under the thumb of the boss or a corporate entity. It is an education in not having a say in your workplace, in kind of being brought to heel. That's certainly right. For me. I never had a real robust labor consciousness when I was working all these kind of low wage jobs. If I was being treated so horribly that I didn't want to stay, my only option in my head was to just leave, and to try to find another paycheck somehow so that I can, pay for food and rent and stuff like that. But I never once kind of felt like I had any power in that situation. And I almost feel like a lot of the jobs, when union density is so low, when labor law is so stacked in favor of the bosses, when recourse for workers is so little in this country, it really does feel like a sort of, form of social engineering when we go into these jobs to, be reminded at every turn that, we are, the kind of listless playthings, to use Kurt Vonnegut's terms, of enormous forces that we have no say over.
And that's why I think stories like this stories like the labor reports we've been talking about are so important, so that the Evans of the world can understand that they're not alone. Yeah, despair comes from helplessness, right? It comes from a sense that there's no hope, that there's no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher would say, even these brutal experiments they did on dogs that they shouldn't have done, but showed that once they think there's no way out, they're broken, and I despair that they did those experiments. But that's what, in effect, so much of our labor economy is trying to do to working people, make them feel the same way. Well, you better take this because it's all you're going to get. And this is why solidarity is so important, right? Understanding that we're together and that we're not alone, and putting our mirror neurons to work, empathizing with one another. That to me is the road to a better world, and a way out of this. But if you have any closing thoughts, Max, I will give them to you.
I thought you put it beautifully, man. And I guess I would say, because I totally understand for folks listening that this is an especially heavy topic. As I said, it I think is very easily the hardest working people episode that I've ever done. But I'm glad that we did it, and I thank those who are able to for listening to it. If you're not able to listen to it because it's triggering or just too much, please help us spread the word. The Evans family has gone through more than any family should have, and they are still trying to kind of muster the courage to share Evan's story so that the people at this store in Milford, Ohio, including the Kroger company itself, the store manager Shannon Frazee, another manager Joseph Pig, who were named in the family's lawsuit, are held accountable. But also so that workers everywhere, especially at Kroger, are not subjected to this kind of horrifying treatment elsewhere. So please help us spread the word if you can. But I guess, to really tie it all back, Richard, to kind of where we started with this, it is important to highlight these stories. It is important to highlight them in this way where you don't just have the tragic headline, but you get to know the person behind that headline and the immense amount of pain that they suffered through, that you yourself as a sympathetic, empathetic human being can feel deep in your bones and know that no one deserves this. No one deserved to go through what Evan went through. And, in any society that has anything resembling justice, the people who wronged Evan, the people who failed Evan, including the Kroger Corporation itself, will be held accountable for treating him this way. Because as I said, he's no longer here and his family will never be able to make that up. So I think that the more that we share those stories, the more that we open our own hearts to that pain and to, the reality of what working people in this country and beyond go through, the more that we can feel that sort of solidarity that we are encouraged not to feel in this society that turns us into cannibals against one another. I know it can hurt, but it's important to let ourselves feel that solidarity, because only that way will we have the strength and the courage and the support to push back. And that's what I hope really comes from, sharing this story, Evans and the workers in Kentucky and all the other workers that we talked to.
And the psychologist Judith Herman says the way we recover from trauma and grief is by telling our story and helping others. So thank you for your part in doing all of that, and everyone at The Real News. My guest has been Maximillian Alvarez, editor-in-chief of The Real News, which you can find at therealnews.com. As always, brother, thanks for the great work, and as always, great talking with you.
Thanks, brother. Right back at you.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.